The sun was setting over the city, casting an orange hue across the skyline as Emily pulled her car into the parking lot of her new apartment complex. She had just moved to the area, leaving behind her old life, and the decision had been difficult. It wasn't that she didn't like her previous home, it was simply time to start over. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, a breakup that left her heartbroken, a strained relationship with her family, and the overwhelming feeling that she had been stuck in a cycle. So, after weeks of searching, Emily had found this small, cozy apartment nestled in a quiet neighborhood. It seemed perfect for a fresh start. The peaceful ambience of the area was exactly what she needed to find some peace in her turbulent life. Her friends had told her that moving away might be exactly what she needed. A change of scenery, a new environment, they said, offering her advice with good intentions. Emily hadn't fully bought into the idea of a new beginning, but she was willing to give it a try. She had rented the apartment online without visiting, simply trusting the photos and descriptions. The space was modest, a one-bedroom unit with large windows that allowed the sunlight to pour in during the day, and a nice view of the surrounding trees in the evenings. It was small but comfortable enough for one person, and that's all she needed. As she stepped out of her car and grabbed a few boxes from the trunk, she looked up at the building. The apartment complex was a quiet, old-fashioned structure, and although it had a certain charm, there was something oddly eerie about it. The long, narrow hallways and the soft hum of the building's aging infrastructure gave the place an old-school feel. The landlord, an elderly man who had met her earlier, had been friendly, but there was something unsettling about his slow movements and the way his eyes lingered on her when they spoke. He had mentioned that the building had been around for a while, but nothing ever bad happened here. Still, Emily could not shake the odd feeling that something was off. Once she made her way up to her apartment, she unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The wooden floors creaked under her feet as she took in her new home. The living room was small, but it had a sense of warmth to it. There was an old-fashioned radiator along one wall, a couch in the middle of the room, and a modest kitchen area tucked into one corner. The bedroom was simple, nothing special, but the bed was just what she needed for a good night's rest after the long day of moving. There was a mirror above the dresser that caught her attention for a moment, but she quickly turned away, her mind racing with thoughts of everything she had left behind. She spent the next few hours unpacking, hanging pictures, and setting up her things. With each piece of furniture she arranged, the apartment began to feel more like home. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and pizza as she made her first meal in the apartment. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her worries lift just a little. Maybe this move was the fresh start she needed. As the night fell, Emily decided to settle in for the evening. She was tired from the move, but there was still a sense of excitement and nervousness swirling inside her. She flipped on the TV, not particularly interested in what was on but wanting to fill the silence. There was a quiet hum in the apartment, the kind of sound that came with old buildings. The refrigerator buzzed softly in the background, and the air felt slightly cooler now that the sun had set. After an hour, Emily turned off the TV and started to get ready for bed. As she climbed under the covers and turned off the lamp beside her, she noticed how silent everything was. The apartment had a calmness that she appreciated, but there was something about the silence that made her uneasy. She pulled the covers up to her chin, feeling the soft sheets against her skin, and tried to relax. But as she closed her eyes, she felt it, a sensation she couldn't explain. It was a strange, creeping feeling that seemed to grow with each passing second. It wasn't that she was afraid, at least not yet. It was more like a vague sense that someone or something was in the room with her. She opened her eyes, scanning the dark room. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the air felt heavier than it had earlier in the day. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that it was just her imagination. Maybe it was the newness of the place, the unfamiliar sounds of an empty apartment. She'd heard stories about people feeling uneasy in new spaces, especially at night. Maybe she was just adjusting to the change. But as she lay there, she couldn't help but feel that there was something more to it, something unseen, watching her. After a few moments, she rolled over and tried to fall asleep, convincing herself that there was nothing to worry about. She was just tired, and the quiet was making her more aware of her surroundings. Slowly, her breathing steadied and her eyelids grew heavier. She began to drift off to sleep, but the feeling of being watched remained, lingering in the back of her mind. Little did she know that her peaceful nights were about to become anything but. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful, or at least that's what Emily thought at first. During the day, everything felt normal, as if she was living in an ordinary space. She went about her routine, work, meals, and relaxing at home in the evenings. But every night, just as she was about to fall asleep, the feeling would return. It was subtle at first, an uneasy sensation that crawled under her skin and made her toss and turn in bed. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, but no clear reason for the fear ever emerged. The apartment was empty, quiet, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started with the shadows. At first, she dismissed it as the natural play of dim light in the corners of her room. The streetlights outside would cast elongated shapes through the blinds, and in the stillness of the night, the shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't have. But the longer Emily stayed in the apartment, the more certain she became that it wasn't just shadows. Something was in the room with her, something that wasn't visible but always present. She would wake up to see the faint outline of dark shapes lingering at the edge of her vision, but by the time she turned her head to look, there would be nothing there. She couldn't pinpoint when it began, this sense that she wasn't alone. Maybe it was the soft sounds of something scraping against the walls late at night, or the low hum of a distant noise that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, she thought it was the old building settling, but the longer she stayed, the more convinced she became that it was something else. Every night, as she lay in bed, her eyes would dart toward the corners of the room. She knew she shouldn't look. She knew it would only make her more paranoid, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She would stare at the empty spaces in her room, convinced that something was waiting for her to acknowledge it. One night, while reading on her couch before bed, she felt a cold chill run down her spine. The room had grown unnaturally quiet, and she instinctively glanced toward the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw it. A dark figure standing motionless at the end of the hall, just beyond the doorway to her bedroom. It was tall, its features obscured in shadow, and it didn't move. She blinked, and when she looked back, the figure was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. Had she imagined it? It had only been there for a split second, but it felt so real. Emily tried to convince herself that she had been seeing things. Maybe the dim lighting in the hallway had played tricks on her eyes. After all, it was an old apartment, and the lighting wasn't the best. She set her book down, turned off the lamp, and went to bed, determined not to let her imagination get the best of her. But as soon as she lay down, the sensation of being watched returned. Her heart began to race. She turned on her side, trying to find a more comfortable position, but every time she closed her eyes, the unease would build again. She couldn't explain it. It was as if someone or something was standing just inches from her, observing her every move. The room felt colder, the air thicker, and every little noise seemed amplified. That night, she woke up around 2:30 a.m. drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, and she could feel her muscles tense with fear. She quickly sat up in bed and scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The light from the street outside filtered in through the blinds, casting faint shadows across the room, but there was nothing threatening or out of the ordinary. Yet, despite the emptiness of the room, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just beyond her vision, hiding in the darkness. She threw the covers off and quickly got out of bed. Maybe moving around would help calm her nerves. She checked the windows and locked the door to her bedroom, even though she knew it had been locked before she fell asleep. Everything seemed secure, but the feeling of being watched never left her. She returned to bed and tried to sleep, but the thought of that figure she'd seen earlier haunted her mind. She had never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural occurrences, but something about this place was different. There was a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant sound made her jump. The following night, Emily decided to confront whatever was causing this unease. She couldn't keep living like this, on edge every time the sun set. She bought a small security camera system and set it up in the bedroom and living room. She knew it sounded silly, but she needed to prove to herself that there was nothing strange going on. If it was just her mind playing tricks on her, then seeing the footage would calm her nerves. The next few nights, she carefully reviewed the footage before bed. At first, there was nothing remarkable. The cameras captured nothing but her going about her usual routine, moving around the apartment or sleeping soundly. But then one night, as she watched the footage from the living room camera, she saw a shadow moving across the wall behind her while she was reading on the couch. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The shadow was too distinct, too purposeful, and it moved on its own. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she paused the video. She stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But there was no denying it. The shadow was there, and it wasn't a figment of her imagination. The realization hit her hard. She was not alone. Something or someone was watching her every night. As the days went by, Emily's unease grew into a full-blown fear. She had tried to rationalize the strange occurrences in her apartment, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. The shadow that she'd seen on the camera wasn't just a one-time thing, it was a repeated phenomenon. Every night, around the same time, the shadow would appear, lurking in the corners of her room or moving across the walls in the living room. Sometimes it would pass quickly, but other times it seemed to linger, stretching and shrinking in strange patterns. Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, she decided to keep herself awake long enough to confront the shadow. She sat on the couch, eyes glued to the camera feed on her phone. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that made the smallest noise feel like a thunderclap. The hours stretched on, and just as she was beginning to doubt herself, she saw it again. At exactly 3 a.m., the same shadow appeared in the hallway, creeping along the floor, moving steadily toward her bedroom door. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched in disbelief. She knew she should go check it out, but fear held her still. The shadow moved too fluidly, too deliberately to be anything natural. It was almost as if it knew she was watching, almost as if it was waiting for her to react. She turned off the camera feed and sat frozen in the darkness, waiting for the shadow to vanish. The clock ticked, the minutes crawling by as she gathered the courage to get up and investigate. But when she finally dared to look out into the hallway, there was nothing there, just the faint light from the street lamps outside filtering in through the window. Emily didn't know what to make of it. She couldn't explain what she had seen. Had it been a trick of the light? Or was there something else going on, something beyond her understanding? The sense of dread settled in her stomach, thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. She quickly turned on the lights, pacing around the apartment, checking every corner. The shadows, the sounds, it all felt too real to dismiss as mere paranoia. The next night, things took a darker turn. As Emily prepared for bed, she noticed something odd. The bedroom window, which she had made sure was securely closed earlier in the day, was now slightly ajar. A cool draft filtered in from outside, and she could hear the distant rustling of leaves in the trees. She was certain she had locked it. Panic began to rise in her chest as she quickly closed the window and checked the lock. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, as though something was standing just beyond the glass, staring in at her. But that wasn't the only strange thing. Emily noticed that her belongings were starting to shift in subtle ways. Her keys, which she always left on the kitchen counter, had inexplicably appeared on the living room table. Her favorite coffee mug, which she had placed on the shelf earlier in the day, was now lying on the floor, cracked down the middle. The more she looked around, the more she found things out of place. It wasn't enough to make a scene of it, but it was enough to unsettle her. At night, the noises began, soft whispers, barely audible at first, but gradually growing louder. They seemed to come from nowhere, from the walls, the floorboards, the very air itself. The whispers were unintelligible, but their tone was unmistakable. They were familiar, like voices she should know, but distorted, like a memory that had faded beyond recognition. Emily tried to block them out, but they followed her everywhere, creeping into her mind and refusing to leave. The sounds didn't stop when she left the apartment either. She'd go to work, running errands, or meeting friends for coffee, but no matter where she went, the echoes of the whispers would follow her. It was as if the apartment's strange presence had latched onto her, refusing to let go. And it wasn't just the whispers. In the middle of the day, when she was alone in her apartment, the lights would flicker and the temperature would drop suddenly as if a cold hand had brushed across her skin. One afternoon, while sitting at her kitchen table, Emily heard a loud bang from the bedroom. She rushed to investigate, half expecting to find a broken piece of furniture or perhaps a door that had slammed shut from the wind. But when she entered the room, there was nothing out of place except for the mirror above her dresser. The glass was cracked. A jagged line ran through the middle of it as if something had struck it from the inside. The weirdest part? The crack didn't appear to come from the outside. It looked as if something had tried to break out from behind the mirror itself. Emily's pulse quickened, her breath shallow as she stared at the cracked glass. It felt like a warning, a sign that whatever was in her apartment was becoming more and more aggressive. But she couldn't understand why it was happening. She had been careful not to acknowledge it, to avoid the presence that seemed to follow her every move. Why was it becoming more violent? In desperation, Emily began to research the building's history. She talked to some of the neighbors, hoping to uncover any clues about the strange occurrences. It was there, during one of her conversations with an elderly woman who lived down the hall, that she learned the disturbing truth. The apartment had once been the site of a tragedy. Several decades ago, a man had mysteriously disappeared after living in the same unit Emily now occupied. His disappearance had never been explained, and the building had remained quiet about it, almost as if the past was trying to stay hidden. But one thing the elderly woman told her stuck in Emily's mind: the building has its secrets. And if you listen closely, they'll speak to you. Emily began to wonder if this was the same entity, whatever it was, that had plagued the apartment for years. If that were true, it meant that the apartment wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on fear and drawing strength from those who lived there. And Emily was starting to feel it. The fear was consuming her. It was getting harder to ignore, harder to push away. The apartment's grip on her was tightening with each passing day. As the strange incidents escalated, Emily found herself in a state of constant anxiety. The whispers had become more pronounced, louder, even audible to others. But they never made sense. She could no longer pretend that her apartment was just an old building with weird quirks. The shadowy figures, the noises, the shifting objects, none of it could be explained away by logical reasoning. The feeling of being watched was now a constant presence, seeping into her every moment, and Emily realized she couldn't face this on her own anymore. She needed answers. One evening, after yet another sleepless night of hearing strange noises from the dark corners of her apartment, Emily sat at her desk, desperately searching online for explanations. She researched everything she could think of: ghosts, hauntings, poltergeists, and entities that seemed to target individuals. Her search led her to various forums where people discussed their own paranormal experiences. Some claimed to have been plagued by similar occurrences, while others seemed to have found answers. Emily quickly bookmarked pages and noted down information, but nothing seemed to match her exact situation. She needed something more concrete, something that could guide her toward understanding what was happening. The next morning, after a restless night of researching, Emily remembered the conversation she had with the elderly woman in the hallway, the one about the building's history. The woman had said something that stuck with her: the building has its secrets. What if those secrets weren't just figurative? What if the building itself was holding something back, something dark, something evil? Determined to find the truth, Emily decided to visit the local library and dig deeper into the building's past. She hoped to uncover something, anything that could explain the strange events happening to her. She spent hours combing through old records, newspaper clippings, and municipal archives. After a long search, she finally stumbled upon a newspaper article from several decades ago. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance in Riverside Apartments." The article told the story of a man named Victor Hayes who had lived in Emily's exact apartment years before her. Hayes had disappeared without a trace, and his sudden vanishing remained a cold case. His family had searched for him for months, but there was no sign of him, and eventually the case was dropped. There was no explanation, no clues, no evidence. But what caught Emily's attention was a line in the article that seemed odd. The building's management refuses to comment on the details of his disappearance, though sources claim that strange occurrences began shortly after his vanishing. This line sent a chill down Emily's spine. She immediately began to focus her attention on that phrase, sensing that there was more to the story than met the eye. She spent the next few days trying to track down more information about Victor Hayes and the events that had unfolded in the building. She contacted a few old tenants who had lived there at the time of the disappearance, but most of them had moved away. However, one elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades was willing to speak to her. The woman, who was now in her 80s, seemed hesitant at first but finally agreed to meet Emily at a local cafe. When Emily sat down with the woman, she was struck by the intensity in the old woman's eyes. It was as though she had been waiting for someone to ask about the apartment. As soon as Emily mentioned Victor Hayes, the woman's face paled and she looked around nervously before speaking in a hushed tone. Victor, she said slowly, wasn't like other tenants. He was a quiet man, kept to himself. But there was something about him that didn't sit right with the others. Some of the neighbors said they heard strange noises coming from his apartment, and there were rumors that he had been involved in some dark practices. But no one ever saw anything concrete. It wasn't until he disappeared that people started noticing things. Objects moving on their own, strange shadows, and whispers at night. It got so bad that the building had to hire someone to investigate. Emily listened intently as the woman continued. She spoke of rumors that Victor had been dabbling in occult practices, perhaps even inviting something into the apartment that shouldn't have been there. but no one could say for sure. What was known, however, was that after his disappearance, the strange occurrences grew stronger. The building became notorious for its bizarre events, with tenants moving out one after another, unable to deal with the constant terror. The woman's voice grew quieter. There are those who say Victor didn't just disappear. They say he became something else. Something that still lingers in that apartment. Emily was shaken to her core. She had suspected something dark was at play, but hearing it from someone who had lived through the terror made her realize just how deep the mystery ran. Whatever Victor had been involved in, it had left a mark on the building. And now it was her turn to face whatever he had unleashed. After leaving the cafe, Emily felt both horrified and determined. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Her apartment wasn't just haunted by a ghost. It was being affected by whatever dark forces Victor had invited in. She needed to understand what kind of entity this was, and how she could stop it before it consumed her completely. Her next step was to find someone who could help. She had read about paranormal investigators online, and she decided to reach out to a group that specialized in these types of hauntings. After explaining her situation to them, they agreed to come to her apartment. Emily felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could uncover the truth and help her escape the nightmare she had found herself trapped in. But as she awaited their arrival, one question gnawed at her. If Victor's presence was still in the building, was she in danger of becoming like him? Was the apartment changing her, just as it had changed him? When the team of paranormal investigators finally arrived at Emily's apartment, she felt a mix of anxiety and relief. She had tried everything she could on her own: research, talking to neighbors, even reaching out to strangers who might have had similar experiences, but none of it had brought her any closer to understanding what was happening. Now, with the experts in the field at her doorstep, Emily hoped they could finally uncover the truth behind the sinister presence that had been tormenting her for weeks. The team consisted of 3 members: a lead investigator named John, a psychic named Rachel, and a tech specialist named Mark. John was the one who spoke the most, explaining their process and the equipment they would be using. Mark set up an array of cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders throughout the apartment, while Rachel, the psychic, began to feel the energy in the space. Rachel's ability to sense and interpret the presence of spirits was well known among the team, and Emily had read about her in online reviews. The thought of a psychic helping to decipher the strange energy in her apartment gave her a small sense of hope, but there was also a lingering doubt. What if Rachel's abilities weren't enough to reveal the truth? What if they were dealing with something more malevolent than anyone could understand? As the investigation began, Emily felt both on edge and strangely detached. The team moved methodically through the apartment, setting up cameras and documenting every detail. They began in the living room, a place that had seen a lot of the strange occurrences, especially the movement of objects and the shadowy figure that appeared on the cameras. Rachel closed her eyes and stood in the middle of the room, her hands raised slightly as if she were sensing something invisible. She murmured softly under her breath, her brow furrowing as she tuned into the energy around her. "I'm picking up something strong in this room," Rachel said quietly, her voice tense. "It's old, very old. And it feels angry. It's been waiting." Emily's heart skipped a beat. That was exactly what she had been feeling for days. The oppressive, ever-present energy that weighed heavily on her chest. It wasn't just a haunting, it was something more. Rachel motioned for Emily to come closer. "There's something about this apartment that draws energy to it. It's like it's feeding off fear, off the emotions of whoever lives here. Whoever was in this space before you, they invited it in." John, who had been watching Rachel closely, nodded gravely. "We've seen this before. This is more than just a haunting. It's a kind of possession, or at the very least, an attachment. Whatever entity is here is feeding off of you, off your fear, your anxiety." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She had always felt that something was watching her, lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to succumb to the fear that had been slowly consuming her. Now, the team confirmed her worst fears. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something alive in the apartment. It had been waiting for her to notice it, to acknowledge its existence. Mark, who had been busy setting up equipment in the bedroom, called out from the other room. "We've got something. It's on the thermal camera." Emily rushed into the bedroom, her heart pounding. On the screen, the thermal camera displayed a faint but unmistakable outline of a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was humanoid, but the edges of the figure were blurry and distorted, as if the entity was shifting, constantly moving. "That's it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the shadow." John and Rachel exchanged glances. "We've caught it on camera," John said, his voice serious. "But it's not just any shadow. This is a manifestation, an intelligent one. It knows you're here. As the night wore on, the investigation continued. The team gathered evidence, but the presence in the apartment seemed to grow more agitated. The temperature in the apartment dropped suddenly and the lights began to flicker sporadically. The air grew thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. Emily could feel her heart racing, her body reacting to the strange energy that surrounded them. Rachel's eyes snapped open as she clutched her head in pain. "It's getting stronger," she said, her voice strained. "This entity is angry. It doesn't want us here. It wants to be left alone." Emily looked at her, desperate. "What do we do? How do we get rid of it?" Rachel's face was pale, her features drawn tight. "It's not something that can be easily banished. This is a dark force, something that has been here for a long time. It needs to be fed. And the more it feeds, the stronger it gets." John stepped forward, his expression grim. "We can try to cleanse the apartment, but it's not going to be easy. This is beyond a simple exorcism. We may have to destroy the entity's anchor, the source of its power. But if we don't do this right, it could turn on you. And it might never leave." The words sent a chill through Emily. Destroy the source of its power? What did that even mean? The entity was tied to the apartment, to the building itself. Could it be Victor's presence, whatever remained of him, that was fueling it? As Rachel began to set up a ritual to cleanse the apartment, Emily asked, "Can you be sure this will work? Can you guarantee I'll be safe after?" Rachel hesitated, her eyes meeting Emily's. "No, I can't. But I can promise that we'll try. We'll do everything we can to help you." As the ritual began, the temperature dropped even further and the lights flickered wildly. The apartment seemed to pulse with an almost palpable energy, as though something was stirring beneath the surface. Emily could feel the weight of the entity's presence, pressing against her from all sides. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of the entity itself or of the possibility that it would never truly leave her. The team worked quickly, chanting and performing the rituals they had researched, hoping that it would be enough to banish the entity once and for all. But as the hours passed, Emily wondered if they were too late. The darkness in her apartment seemed to have grown even stronger. The ritual seemed to be having little effect. Emily could feel it in the air, the oppressive, suffocating weight of the entity was not lifting. The temperature had dropped so low that her breath was visible in the air, and the shadows in the corners of the apartment seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The flickering lights only added to the chaos, casting eerie, erratic glows that distorted the already unsettling atmosphere. It was as though the building itself was alive, reacting to the ritual, pushing back against the cleansing force. John, the lead investigator, was the first to speak up. His voice was firm but tinged with unease. "This isn't right. It's not just an entity anymore. It's more like it's controlling the apartment, using it as a vessel to manifest." Emily's heart began to race. She had already suspected that whatever was haunting her wasn't just a spirit. It was something far darker. But hearing John confirm her fears made everything feel even more real. The entity wasn't just haunting her. It had taken root in the very fabric of the apartment, feeding off her fear, feeding off her presence. Rachel's face was pale, her hands shaking as she clutched the talisman she had been using to conduct the ritual. I don't think the ritual will work. Not unless we do something more. Something more drastic." Emily's mind was spinning. What did she mean by more drastic? The ritual was supposed to be the last resort, the final measure to cleanse the apartment, to free her from the torment. But now Rachel was suggesting it might not be enough. Could the entity be too powerful to be banished so easily? Before Emily could voice her questions, the air in the apartment seemed to shift, an unnatural stillness settled over the room and the temperature dropped even further. A low, guttural growl emanated from the corner of the living room where the shadow had appeared many times before. Emily turned, her eyes wide with fear, and watched as the shape in the corner began to take form. The shadow was no longer a mere outline. It became a solid, dark mass taller than any human, with long, twisted limbs and an impossibly large head. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were glowing red embers that seemed to burn into Emily's very soul. The figure stood there, staring at her, radiating an energy so dark and terrifying that Emily felt as if she were being suffocated. John stepped forward, holding up a silver cross that he had used during investigations in the past. "This is what we've been preparing for," he said quietly. "We're going to have to confront it head-on. But we can't do it alone. Emily, you need to stand with us. This entity is tied to you now. It's been feeding off you, and you're the only one who can weaken it." Emily's eyes darted from John to Rachel and then back to the shadow that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. Her body shook with fear, but something inside her snapped. She couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from whatever was in her apartment. She had to face it, whatever it was. The truth was out there now, and there was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. What do I need to do? Rachel, still clutching the talisman, nodded gravely. You have to confront it. You have to face the fear it's been feeding off. Don't let it control you. If you're strong enough, you can weaken it. The shadow shifted and the growl deepened into a horrific roar that shook the walls. The lights flickered violently and the air grew thick with a palpable malevolence. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest and every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. But she didn't. She couldn't. She stood tall, her gaze fixed on the dark figure before her. You won't control me, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I won't let you. The figure lunged toward her, its shadowy tendrils reaching for her like claws. In that instant, something inside Emily snapped. All the fear, all the pain, all the sleepless nights, it all boiled over. She had lived in terror long enough. She couldn't be its victim anymore. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the dark entity. As she did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. Her breath became a fog in the frigid air, but she pushed forward, gripping the talisman that Rachel had handed her tightly in her hand. It was as though she were fighting for her very life, but there was something else, something deep inside her that felt powerful, almost like a surge of energy. This is my home. This is my life. You don't belong here. With a cry of determination, Emily held the talisman high, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, she was not afraid. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't going to let this thing take control of her. The shadow recoiled as if struck by an invisible force. The red glow of its eyes flickered, and for a moment it seemed to hesitate. Emily seized that moment, using everything inside her to push back. The entity writhed and screamed, its form distorting and flickering, as if it were struggling against the energy she was now channeling. The temperature in the room began to rise again, the darkness receding as the light slowly returned. John and Rachel stood behind her, their chants growing louder, their voices a force of unity that helped Emily stand her ground. The shadow screeched one last time, a horrible, agonized cry that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Then, with a final, piercing sound, it vanished. For a few long seconds, the apartment was silent. The oppressive air lifted, the temperature returned to normal, and the flickering lights steadied. Emily stood there, breathing heavily, her heart still racing, but now filled with a sense of victory she hadn't known she had in her. It was over. The entity was gone. But as Emily looked around the apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, lingering just beyond the edges of her vision. She had fought back the darkness, but had she truly won? Or was there more to this apartment's sinister history than anyone had uncovered? The silence that followed the confrontation was both a relief and a burden. For the first time in weeks, Emily was able to breathe freely. The weight of the oppressive presence that had plagued her every waking moment had finally lifted. The entity that had stalked her, that had tormented her for so long, was gone, or so it seemed. The room no longer felt cold and suffocating. The air was warmer, the shadows less sinister. It was as if the apartment had been reborn, the dark energy that had once filled every corner now absent. But despite the victory, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her body was physically exhausted, her mind reeling from the intense emotional and spiritual battle she had just faced. She had confronted the darkness head-on, and yet, there was an undeniable sense of unease that lingered in the back of her mind. The ordeal was over, but the emotional scars would remain, and the trauma of what she had experienced would take time to heal. As the paranormal team began to pack up their equipment, John approached Emily with a solemn expression. "We've gathered some compelling evidence," he said quietly. "The thermal camera, the audio recordings, it all points to something far more than just a random haunting. Whatever it was that was haunting this place, it wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something darker, something ancient." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I know. I could feel it. It wasn't just a presence. It was alive, feeding off my fear." John sighed. "This wasn't just a haunting. It was an attachment. Something that latched onto you, Emily. And while we were able to remove it for now, there's a chance it could return if the conditions are right." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. It could return? The thought that the entity might come back was something Emily hadn't considered. She had thought that once it was gone, that would be the end of it. But the reality was much more complicated. This wasn't something that could simply be wished away with a few chants and rituals. The entity had been feeding off her, growing stronger the longer it stayed. And while they had banished it for now, there was always the possibility that it could find a way back. Rachel, who had been standing off to the side, spoke up. "We were able to sever the connection for now, but I recommend you leave this apartment. At least for a while. The energy here is tainted, and it could attract more negative entities if you stay." The suggestion hit Emily like a wave. Leave? It felt impossible. This was her home, her sanctuary. She had fought so hard to keep it, to make it hers. But now, after everything that had happened, she wasn't sure if it was safe anymore. The apartment had become a battleground, and while she had won the war, the scars of the conflict remained. "Where would I go?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it follows me?" Rachel gave her a sympathetic look. "I can't promise that it won't follow you, but the best thing you can do right now is to remove yourself from the place that was the anchor for the entity. If you stay here, you might be giving it a way back in." Emily's mind raced. She felt a deep sense of loss, as though the apartment, her home, was slipping through her fingers. But as the minutes passed and the weight of Rachel's words settled in, Emily realized that she had no other choice. She needed to leave. For her own safety. For her peace of mind. The decision wasn't easy. The apartment had been a part of her life for so long, and it was where she had built so many memories. But the trauma of what had happened, the fear that had almost consumed her, made it clear that she couldn't stay. The apartment was no longer a safe place, it was a reminder of the darkness that had almost destroyed her. The paranormal team left shortly after, promising to check in with Emily in the coming weeks. They left behind their evidence, and John handed her a file containing their findings. "We'll keep you updated on anything we discover," he said. "You might want to take a look at these recordings. There could be something useful in there for you." As Emily sat down in the empty apartment, the finality of the situation settled in. She was leaving. She had no idea where she would go next, but the idea of starting over, of finding a new place, felt like the only option left. She couldn't stay here, not after everything that had happened. Days passed as Emily made arrangements to move out. Her heart felt heavy as she packed her belongings, each item a reminder of the life she had built in this apartment and the terror that had torn it all apart. But even as she prepared to leave, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The apartment was no longer her prison, it was simply a place where something dark had lived. And now it was time to let go. When the day finally came to leave, Emily stood at the threshold of the apartment one last time. She took a deep breath, looking around the space that had once been her home. It was quiet now, the silence almost oppressive. But the fear was gone. The darkness had been pushed out, at least for now. Emily stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. She didn't know what the future held or where she would go from here, but she knew one thing for sure: she had survived. And that was enough. The days following Emily's departure from the apartment were filled with a sense of emptiness. She had left behind the place that had once been her home, the space she had tried so desperately to reclaim from the darkness. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself that it was the right decision, a part of her felt lost. The apartment had been a constant in her life, a place that anchored her, and now it was gone, along with all the memories and the safety she had once found within its walls. But as time passed, Emily slowly began to heal. She moved into a new apartment, one that was far from the shadows of the old one. The new place was bright, filled with natural light, and had an air of warmth that made it feel like a fresh start. There was no oppressive energy here, no lingering sense of something watching her. It was a sanctuary, her sanctuary. And for the first time in months, she could finally relax. Still, Emily couldn't shake the memories of what had happened. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced that the entity had somehow followed her. The shadows would seem to stretch just a little too far, and the silence would feel too heavy, too oppressive. But each time she would remind herself the entity was gone. She had faced it. She had survived. Rachel and John had checked in with Emily several times, offering their support and guidance as she adjusted to her new life. They had continued their research into the entity, and while they hadn't discovered anything particularly new, they had assured Emily that the apartment was likely safe. The ritual had severed the connection, and while there was always a chance that something could return, they were confident that the entity had been banished for good. But even with their reassurances, Emily couldn't forget the feeling of being watched. It was as though something had been left behind, an invisible tether that connected her to that place. She had hoped that leaving the apartment would sever that bond completely, but she knew deep down that the experience would never truly leave her. The fear, the darkness, it had become a part of her now. Determined not to let the past control her, Emily began to seek out ways to move forward. She started attending therapy to work through the trauma of the haunting, learning how to cope with the residual fear that still lingered in her mind. She began journaling her experiences, writing about everything she had gone through in an effort to understand it all, to make sense of the darkness that had almost consumed her. Writing became a form of therapy, allowing her to confront the emotions she had kept buried for so long. As the months passed, Emily began to feel a sense of peace returning to her life. The nightmares lessened, the sense of being watched gradually faded, and she found herself able to enjoy life again. She began to make new memories, to rebuild the life that had been shattered by the entity's presence. She spent time with friends, took up new hobbies, and even started volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding comfort in the simplicity of helping others. But even as she found her footing in this new chapter of her life, Emily remained cautious. The haunting had taught her that the world was far more mysterious and dangerous than she had ever realized. She had faced something that no one should ever have to face, and although the entity was gone, the knowledge that there were forces beyond her understanding lingered in her mind. She didn't know what else might be out there, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let fear control her again. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. Emily also began to keep in touch with Rachel and John. They had formed a bond through the experience, and they often shared their findings about other paranormal cases. While Emily didn't actively seek out more experiences like the one she had gone through, she felt a sense of duty to help others who might be going through something similar. She even considered starting her own blog to document her story and offer support to others who had encountered the unknown. As the year drew to a close, Emily found herself standing on the balcony of her new apartment, looking out over the city skyline. The lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world she had rejoined after so many long months of isolation. She could hear the hum of life all around her, the sounds of people living, laughing, and going about their daily routines. It was a far cry from the isolation she had felt in the old apartment, where the silence had been oppressive and the darkness suffocating. Now she felt a sense of freedom, of possibility. Emily had emerged from the darkness. The entity that had haunted her was gone, but the experience had left its mark. She wasn't the same person she had been before. She was stronger, more aware of the world around her and the mysteries it held. But most importantly, she had learned that even in the face of fear, she could overcome it. She could survive. And that knowledge, that inner strength, was what would carry her forward into whatever came next. 11.